Hey, John.
Hey, George.
How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well, but I think the Earth is going crazy.
Yeah? Oh, the Icelandic volcano.
Yeah, but doesn't it seem like we have more than our fair share of natural disasters lately?
Well, it always seems like that, and if you follow that path too far, you'll end up becoming a fundamentalist Christian believing in the prophecies in the book of Revelation.
And there's nothing worse than that.
Well, you can look at those websites. I mean, before it used to be occasional news reports, but now they have their own websites, of course, like everyone else. And, anything like the Icelandic volcano or any natural disaster, is taken as well. Finally, we're seeing the signs, and the apocalypse is coming, and we can all look forward to the rapture, except you evil atheists and believers of non-approved religions. And then this has been going on. I first started noticing it back. I mean, it goes way back before this, but when I was writing Architects of Fear and following these Doomsday conspiracies, as I called them in the book. And then, of course, the history goes way back to the Millerites and really to the beginnings of Christianity. But anyway, I'm sure that's not your point.
Well, no, actually, that's. I mean, I think we've talked before about what is perhaps an innate human tendency to think that we're on the verge of some kind of end time or catastrophe. There is a kind of green version of seeing the apocalypse right around the corner.
Oh, totally, yeah.
Even the people who are into Gaia, the idea that the entire biosphere is one organism that somehow is held perpetuating its own survival. So, this is a very kind of new agey concept, even though there's some scientists who take it very seriously. So you could come up with some kind of bullshit.
There's a non-mystical version.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, people like that could come up with some kind of way of saying that the volcanoes in general are part of some kind of self-regulating mechanism.
Sure.
Or maybe the Earth is just tired of this infestation of humanity, and
it's fighting back.
Yeah, it's like a dog shaking off its fleas.
Right. Well, there were all those volcano movies.
Yeah, right.
In recent years, but yeah, I don't know. Well, yeah, and then of course, with the big flood of New Orleans.
Well, and then the huge earthquake.
The attempts to link that to global warming, and I mean, we do have, I mean, the rational and less rational. There does seem to be this apocalyptic tendency of either fearing or welcoming and hoping for the end times.
I think it's a good thing to be reminded of Mother Nature's power.
Yeah.
Apart from all this mystical mumbo jumbo, I actually saw my father yesterday. I was at Stevens. I had a couple of classes, and my father called me out of the blue, and he was stuck in Newark Airport. He and my stepmom were just about to fly to London, and of course their flight was delayed. And now I think they
because of the Icelandic volcano.
And
that ash gets in those engines.
Yeah, and I felt bad for him because he'd been planning this trip for a long time. On the other hand, there's something wonderful about. Oh God, I feel like this is when especially you, George, we're talking about the thrill of global economic collapse.
Well, that didn't last too long. The thrill.
Back before it happened, and here I am talking about
depression.
Yeah, right. But
you don't want a volcano to. Well, one thing that struck me about all the news about the Icelandic volcano, just how much more attention this got than the one in Montserrat, which is. This I just looked it up to remind me, but it originally erupted in 1995, 15 years ago, and it destroyed the capital of this island in the Caribbean, and it's been erupting on and off ever since. And just a day after we came back from the Caribbean at Christmas, there was an eruption and enough volcanic ash that they were grounding flights in the Caribbean, and it happened again, I think, in February and even more recently, perhaps. But it's always, and then suddenly Iceland comes, and then people talk as if there's not volcanoes erupting over the world all the time.
History is European and North American history, George. You should know that. Who cares if it happens in the third world? Doesn't really happen.
Anyway, I'd love to see it. I've never seen a volcano erupting. And
I remember I was living in Denver in 1980 when Mount St. Helens blew, and
right.
so I sort of saw the news reports and I thought, oh, that's interesting. And then I remember waking up one morning and I walked outside and my Toyota truck was completely covered in ash.
Really? Way down in Denver?
Yeah, it was.
I wasn't sure how far that reached.
Well, it was. I think it affected sunsets because I remember we had these spectacular sunsets as well.
Yeah.
But the ash was really significant.
Yeah, my brother he was actually finishing graduate school in Pullman, Washington, so he was, right up there.
Yeah. And then, of course,
even in Denver, wow. I was on the East Coast then in graduate school, so I missed all the fun.
Well, I also, when I went to the South Pole back in 1992, I guess it was, I was in a helicopter and we flew right over past the edge of Mount Cerebus, which is I don't know if it's called active, but it's certainly smoking.
Wow.
Big volcano on the edge of the Antarctic.
Yeah.
But should we talk about? I guess we have to talk about volcanoes and global warming.
Yeah, I guess. I was just going to say I can see a volcano out my window.
Is that?
It's actually the Jemez mountain range. Is all volcanic, and it's considered dormant. But sometimes you look out there and you see some smoke, and usually turns out to be a controlled Forest Service burn, to clear out vegetation or something like that. But anyway, yeah, I guess there's some scientists under the what is the rubric of geoengineering.
Yeah.
Saying that we should put was it sulfur dioxide, some kind of sulfur compounds, and shoot it into the atmosphere to deflect some of the sunlight and cool off global warming. But if we could have lots of volcanoes erupting constantly all over the planet, that might do it too. Well,
and I think this would be a good way to utilize all of our surplus nuclear weapons. We can just start dropping some of these in dormant volcanoes and blow up the plugs.
To ignite them, but that sounds like it's going to spread some radioactive materials.
Well, George, if you're talking about geoengineering, I mean, you're gonna have to break a few eggs to make the omelet. So, what's a little bit of nuclear fallout?
Yeah, that sounds a little like a proposal to global warming that Lyndon LaRouche might come up with.
Right. Let's take everything bad and combine it.
Yeah.
I've just been Googling volcanoes and climate change this morning, and what makes them so interesting, I guess, is that volcanoes release a fairly significant amount of carbon dioxide, which of course can contribute to global warming. And I guess I've seen different figures, but on average, I guess you get about 100 million tons of carbon dioxide released by volcanoes or just sort of vented from the earth every year, which is less than 1% of what humans are contributing.
Yeah, I was going to say, like coal plants or
it's tiny. But then but that global warming effect is vastly outweighed by the cooling effect of the ash, the particulates, and especially the sulfur compounds, which, as you just mentioned, create these particles that reflect sunlight back away from the Earth's atmosphere. And I found this interesting piece in Scientific American that said that Benjamin Franklin was the first person to point out the possible link between climate cooling and volcanoes. So he was in Europe.
Oh, I saw that too. Yeah. It was an earlier eruption of the same Icelandic volcano, right? And it was affecting the weather in England, and Franklin was there doing diplomatic stuff. And
this is
that's interesting.
This is in I guess 1783, that summer in Europe was really, really cold, and Franklin seems to have attributed. Actually, in this story, it's not clear that he knew about the volcano, but he was
Just the fact that there was all this stuff in the air, and
yes, and that it was really cold. But the story says that the impact on Iceland that summer was horrible, or from the volcano. 70% of the livestock, 25% of the population died either from famine or the direct toxic impact of the clouds from the volcano. According to the records, I don't know how good records could be back then, the global temperature decreased by about 1 degree Celsius. Which is a lot.
Yeah.
And I remember, I'm sure you remember, when Pinatubo, the big Philippine volcano, erupted in 1991. We had a dip in global temperatures that lasted, I think, for 2 or 3 years. And there's, again, this is from the same Scientific American story. There is not necessarily a direct correlation between the size of the ash cloud, just the sheer debris that's spewed into the atmosphere, and the cooling effect. So there was a fairly small Mexican eruption in 1982, El Chichon, I think, that just happened to be particularly high in sulfur content.
Oh, okay.
And so it was much smaller than Mount St. Helens, but it had a much bigger cooling effect because it contained so much more sulfur.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Yeah, well, maybe, I don't know, it's a trade-off. Do you want to have volcanoes erupting all over the place to bring down the global temperature?
Yeah, well, another positive side effect of the volcanoes is the wonderful sunsets.
Yes, right.
So
yeah, I saw Simon Winchester, the guy that he wrote that book about Krakatoa eruption, and you sent me the link. I guess he did an op-ed piece on the Icelandic volcano, and it's just kind of this historical reminiscence of the Krakatoa volcano and all the great artwork it led to.
Yeah. So,
and some people thought that Edvard Munch's painting The Scream, I guess there's at least a story that was painted during a reaction to the sky darkening from the Krakatoa volcano in Scandinavia. The after effects reaching that far.
Right. Climatology and art history. I think there's a new discipline for you.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
In terms of geoengineering, I don't know. Maybe this is the way to go. Just one more volcano story. When I went to the South Pole in the early '90s, I ended up.
Is that for one of those? What is it? Is it AAAS?
National Science Foundation.
National Science Foundation. Yeah, they bring a journalist to the North Pole. To the South Pole to hang out at the scientific stations and things.
Yeah. Oh my God! It was the absolute best junket. Well, I guess I don't know. Some people might prefer junkets where you go to Hawaii and you can go golfing instead of going to your scientific conference.
I'd rather go to Antarctica.
Oh, it was so cool. It was really like going to another planet. It's so foreign down there. And we got to go through the dry valleys, and we went out onto ice floes, and the helicopter would hover above the ice, and
I'd love to do that.
And penguins would hop up on the ice floes and come waddling over and look at us, and we went to the South Pole itself. But the big science story that broke when I was down there was the discovery of volcanoes under the ice sheet that were creating this layer of lubrication. They were melting the bottom of these big glaciers, and there were some scientists who thought that it might, completely apart from global warming, that this effect might accelerate the flow of some of these big glaciers and the ice sheet in general into the ocean and cause a catastrophic rise in sea level.
Wow.
So I haven't tracked that story since then. So
yeah,
I don't know
that'd be interesting. That would obviously amplify the melting effects from global warming and the rise of the sea level, and
Yeah.
Huh.
So again, this crazy Earth, it's still got a lot of surprises left in store for us.
Yeah.
So, all right, let's see. That's
Yeah, what else have you been doing? Well, you had a piece in, yeah, no, you've been doing these op-ed pieces in Scientific American that keep, really, really angering people.
you know, I don't know if that's my. Oh, I guess it is my intent. I have to just accept that. Yeah. So the one I thought maybe we could talk about was a piece that I wrote on Obama's nuclear policy. So he's gotten a lot of attention recently for this new treaty with Russia to reduce the number of big strategic hydrogen bomb warheads by
Yeah, right.
about a third, and I think that's a great thing. And
Mm-hmm.
Obama has had this vision. Actually, Obama was an undergraduate at Columbia when I was in journalism school there in 1982.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I didn't know him, but apparently, while he was there, the Times had a wonderful story on this. He wrote an article for some kind of campus newspaper, envisioning a world without nuclear weapons, and saying, I think he was even critical of the nuclear freeze movement, which was very popular then, for not being ambitious enough.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just amazing. He's just this kid then, and has this vision of,
Yeah, little did he know one day he'd be in a position to actually do something toward that.
yeah. And so he just signed this reduction, and it's a very good thing. And he's trying to halt proliferation of nuclear weapons. He's taken various steps to safeguard nuclear material around the world. But at the same time, he's doing something that really pisses me off.
Yeah, I know.
And that's he's really, apparently he's been this way through most of his career as a politician. He's very strongly for nuclear energy.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I disagree with him.
Yeah, well, maybe we could talk about that. I've gone back and forth on nukes. Well, I'll just explain what his position is. So very specifically, he recently said that the federal government would put up billions of dollars in loan guarantees for utilities that wanted to invest in new nuclear power plants.
Yeah, which is what it did at the beginning when they were first trying to develop nuclear power before the whole technology got derailed by, a certain amount of environmental paranoia.
Paranoia, okay.
Nah, that may be an exaggeration. I was, as anti-nuke as anybody, but, we've talked a little about this before, but just the more I see what coal power plants are doing to my own part of the country here in the Southwest, as far as the crystal clarity of the air that's, a lot duller than it was before. And then when you read the statistics on, just the pollution that coal plants put out, and then you have things like the coal mining disaster, like the one earlier this month, more people killed by coal power by far than have been killed by nuclear power plants.
Coal sucks. But God, I feel as
let me just read a few statistics on coal that I pulled up. This is, in an average year, a typical coal plant generates 3.7 million tons of carbon dioxide, 10,000 tons of sulfur dioxide, 500 tons of particulate matter, 10,200 tons of nitrogen oxide, 720 tons of carbon monoxide, et cetera, all the way down to 114 pounds of lead, cadmium, various toxic metals, uranium, thorium.
Yeah.
So there's actually a huge amount of nuclear material that's emitted by coal-fired plants, and not as much as by nuclear plants, but at the same time with a nuclear plant, the waste is nice and contained, and you can deal with it instead of just spewing it through the atmosphere.
Yeah, but that waste remains toxic, dangerous, literally hot for thousands of years.
Well, I think the danger, though, has been overblown, and some of this I was reminded by, there's this great article that Matt Wald, who, covers this for the New York Times, did for Scientific American just last year. Mm-hmm. And, the thing about, the nuclear waste, what do we do with all of this huge amount of nuclear waste that's being produced? So it turns out your typical nuclear plant produces, the amount of waste it produces in 1 year would fit in the back of a large bed pickup truck.
Mm-hmm. About 2,000 tons generated by all the nuclear plants in the country. They're about...
Yeah, but this is 33 tons. It's so dense, it'll fit in the back of a pickup truck.
Right.
And here's what really struck me. Mm-hmm. So even though it's contained, and then, I know I've talked about this before on Blogging Heads, but when my brother-in-law is a nuclear engineer, which of course has no influence over my opinion, took my wife and I on a tour of the Yankee plant that he was operating engineer of. This was 15 years ago at least, and just showing us, well, here's where we have the nuclear waste, and I'm kind of looking at this, swimming pool-sized place, and I said, how much, is that from? You mean just the last year? He says, no, that's all the nuclear waste the plant's ever produced in the many years it's been online. Mm-hmm. And then just reading in Wall's article, once you have this fuel, you remove the fuel rods, which is basically enriched and now spent uranium covered in cadmium, and you pull that out and you put it in these big swimming pool things to cool off. In the first year, the heat that's producing drops by 99%.
Right.
And it drops by a factor of 5 by the time the fuel's 4 years old, another 40% by 10 years. But after just a few years, the rods are no longer hot enough. You even have to cool them in water so you can take them out. They drain them, dry them, pump them full of inert gas, and they seal them, and then they pour concrete over them. So I don't know. I mean, is that really worse than obviously it's.
Yeah, it is. I think. I mean, I live near a nuclear.
Why?
I live near a nuclear power plant. And it frightens me. I mentioned in that piece, and this is a very overly personal point of view, perhaps, but one of the plane that on 9/11 started in Boston and then hit the World Trade Center, flew right down the Hudson, right past my house, and right over the Indian Point power plant. And there is some intelligence that indicates that the pilots had considered flying into some kind of nuclear target, and obviously it would have been Indian Point. There's a lot of discussion over whether the plane could have breached the reactor vessel. I think those arguments are inconclusive. I think nobody really knows.
Nobody knows. I mean, there's a lot of strong arguments that it wouldn't. I mean, it wasn't something like running into what was really a fairly fragile structure, the World Trade Center.
But the
steel frame with a lot of air, all this glass, and then on the other hand, you have Indian Point. When they've done these simulations where they've taken similar reinforced concrete structures and run, jet airplanes into them at huge speeds.
I don't trust them.
Well, no, yeah, but
I don't want that. This is a different kind of toxicity and danger than even coal or lots of the other things that we have to worry about in life, and it could create an accident that would permanently poison this region of the earth. It could conceivably create fallout that could kill tens of thousands of people. This is a heavily populated area,
the key word though is conceivably. I mean, does that mean that we shouldn't have any technology that that would cause a disaster if a terrorist ran an airplane into it?
This particular technology is, I think, is so much more significantly dangerous than any other. And, the ceiling of danger is so much higher even than, chemical plants or even coal plants.
I don't know. Well, the ceiling is, but the likelihood. I mean, if you really wanted to kill a lot of people, and you were a terrorist flying an airplane, you'd probably do much better to fly into a chemical plant or even one of the many nitrogen-fixing plants that make anhydrous ammonia all over the farmland, or to rupture an anhydrous ammonia plant going from Texas to Minnesota. And
but those aren't going to
tanker trucks carrying chlorine and anhydrous ammonia, any one of those, if it were in an accident and was breached in the middle of a city, could cause, thousands and thousands of deaths and sicken all these people.
That's bad too. But radio.
But the point is being that, we deal with these.
Call me irrational. The radioactive component of this type of technology is what frightens me. It's permanent. The nuclear waste that you were just talking about, it remains dangerous forever, basically. I mean,
conceivably, yeah.
No, I mean, George, you know that the waste site that they were trying to build in Yucca Mountain, and let me back up a little bit. Another reason I'm annoyed with Barack Obama over his nuclear policy is that he not only is behind a resurgence of nuclear energy, he also has canceled the Yucca Mountain repository after we've spent billions of dollars investing and trying to
but
make
he was
it a viable
really following.
site.
Yeah, but Bush and the Republicans really put the cancellation.
No, I think it was
originally in place because of Harry Reid, right?
Harry Reid is such a powerful Democrat. I'm sure that he and Obama worked out some kind of deal, and Obama needed him for health care and lots of other things. And so they made a deal to kill this thing once and for all. Now we have no viable...
but it's been on the verge of death for so long. But again, I mean, part of my point with...
We have to have some kind of nuclear waste policy. Otherwise, it's just accumulating at all these different sites around the country. Every one of those sites is a potential dirty bomb site. If the pumps fail in these cooling ponds that you're talking about, that waste can become so hot that it can cause a nuclear meltdown before the cooling period that you're talking about, before it gets a little older and they can put it in the dry casks. It's extremely dangerous.
I don't know. See, you're saying I'm not sure it's bad for any reason that they canceled Yucca Flats, because I think the real danger with this waste is going to be if you put it on trucks and start hauling it across the country to some common depository where everybody basically knows where it is, including anyone who would want to breach the cycle and get some of the stuff. But just keep storing it at the plant sites.
That reinforces my point. If it's so dangerous, you don't want to truck it across the country. Why do you want to
keep it in place so your John? What I'm saying is that the national nuclear policy for dealing with nuclear waste should be to keep it on site, and then just really make sure that technology is just right on, and then. So there was someone who in Wall's story, you estimated just in the storage capacity that we have now on site in the nuclear plants, the remaining ones operating in the United States, we're not going to run out of storage space until the end of the century, maybe. So and then if you increase that space, really make sure the cooling technology is good. It's not an irrational plan for power production, and I think it's a lot better than continuing with coal plants, even scrubbing, coal plants with scrubbers, because, there too you're dealing with waste, although you again then have the advantage, like with the nuclear plants, where the waste is more contained.
Instead of investing tens, hundreds of billions, trillions maybe, in a resurgence of nuclear power, and you're saying it's a straight up choice between coal and nuclear. You're right. There are all these other energy options, especially if we take that money that we're talking about investing in nuclear power coming back, which I think economically just is not feasible. Politically, it's not feasible. I don't think it's going to happen anyway. But instead of even talking about it, put that money, take the money that instead of investing even in a whole new repository site for all these additional nuclear power plants that we're going to have, invested in alternative energy, find better sources of solar. There was a wonderful article in the New York Times earlier this week about garbage incinerators in Europe, which are now very, very clean, cheap sources of energy.
That was the next point I was going to make. I mean, for me, if it's coming down between nuclear and coal, I think nuclear is a much better option, and I guess I agree with, Stuart Brand is recently one of the people associated with environmentalism and all of this that's kind of come over to the side, and there was a really good book that was published a couple of years ago. I can't remember the title. making these same environmentalist arguments for nuclear power. So if it came down between nuclear and coal, which it sort of does right now, I think nuclear, but as you say, solar, as another alternative. And I'm not convinced yet that solar can be developed to the point where it'll take over enough of our power needs. But I'm hopeful. I did that piece in National Geographic last fall, and it left me feeling very optimistic. But then you have your own problems, with big solar, where it's, it involves taking over, hundreds of acres of pristine desert land and then, basically lining it up with mirrors and putting in this plant and then having to, put in new power line infrastructure for the grid, because most of the solar energy is produced in areas where it's not immediately needed, so it needs to be transported to places like the East Coast.
I was thinking of that article of yours recently. You may have seen this article in, I think it was the business section of the Times, about the collapse of the solar industry in Spain, which had been, the government had provided all these subsidies for these solar power startups, and so all these new companies came into being. And then the economy went bad, and a lot of these companies, their technology was never very good. Their business plan wasn't that good to begin with. So then
Spain really it really leads the world almost in technology.
Yeah,
Spain and Germany.
But
most of the solar installations in the United States, they're contracting with Spanish companies like Abengoa to put them in.
But they've gone through sort of a boom bust cycle. The problem I have, the only way I could see nuclear coming back in this country is if you had a kind of socialized program like you have in France, or that they have in Sweden, where you get standardization. So if there's a problem in one plant, the lessons can be applied to every single other plant.
I'd be all for socializing it.
But that's not the kind of
totally.
That's not in the cards politically, and it's not nuclear power. Here's another kind of meta argument. It seems it requires very intense security. It requires, I think, a kind of authoritarian control system. And it's not, if I'm thinking about the world, if we're investing in nuclear now, we've got to think about the world 50 or 100 years from now. And I don't want to be, I don't like to think of a world in which you still have these kind of intense security controls and top-down control of the power source that's required for nuclear power, as opposed to most of these other alternative energy sources that we're talking about, which can be much more decentralized, don't have this problem of waste disposal, which is just gigantic. You're talking about deferring that problem indefinitely.
Wait. Which you mean solar doesn't have waste disposal problems, and wind, but coal does.
Yeah, coal does, but not on the same level as nuclear. I mean, you're talking about...
I guess the difference is with nuclear, obviously, you're right that the ceiling of the possible conceivable amount of danger is much, much higher. But on the other hand, the likelihood that that's going to happen, that the containment's going to be breached, is very, 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 very small. On the other hand, coal, the ceiling is not as high of danger, I guess, although when you look at how many tens of thousands of people are estimated to die every year from, breathing particulate matter and other coal pollution, it's,
when you talk about
it's an interesting question, so the coal, the danger may not be as high or at least not as catastrophic. It's, spread out over a century or so. But it's much more likely and easier to, so say you have a scrubbing facility that's actually getting a lot of the gunk out of the smokestacks, then it still has to sequester it someplace. And then, maybe there'd be a dam break, and then suddenly this gunk would all, pour down into a river and pollute some city's water supply. So
when you talk about the
not so
risk,
clear-cut.
when you talk about the risk of a meltdown or a breach of a reactor or these nuclear accidents, you have to factor in the possibility of terrorism. You also have to factor in the possibility of diverting nuclear materials and processes into making nuclear weapons or simply dirty bombs. If the United States starts investing in more nuclear power, then of course everybody else around the world is going to want to do the same thing, including countries that are unstable. I just think it's colossally wrong-headed to go down that path. I mean, I really agree with the Union of Concerned Scientists, sort of the old classic lefty scientific watchdog
group.
Yeah,
that's a great group. That's actually where I got those coal statistics that I was reading off earlier. So they're, so I haven't really followed them lately, but are they really pushing solar in a big way?
No, they're just saying, please don't go down the nuclear path. They talk
about... Yeah, but they're also saying, God, look at all the horrible stuff that coal's doing.
Yeah, so, let's start looking at some of these other energy sources. I mean,
if it really came down to anything, I'd love to see solar, and especially not big solar so much as decentralized solar, because that was the one thing that really struck me, like with photovoltaic technology where, experimental PV cells have gotten up to something like 43% efficiency, but, the guy that I interviewed said something like it would cost $15,000 a square centimeter to produce this stuff now. But, with a jump start from the government and, really getting the industry going and, the cost, scaling effects, you could bring this down. And even with very low efficiency cells, you spread them out all over at least the sunny parts of the country, and you could take care of a great deal of your energy needs. Plus, it wouldn't all be tied to this grid, which is vulnerable in itself.
I think I think we've got to, if we invest enough money and human ingenuity into all these different sources. I mean, I think we've obviously got to have a multiplicity of.
Obama's doing that too. I mean, he called for huge investments in alternative energy compared to any of his predecessors in his initial State of the Union address. But how much money that compares with nuclear, I don't know.
Yeah.
One thing you mentioned in one of your emails that struck me, I think I referred you to the Matt Wald article, and you said something like, well, I'm glad to see some of these old nuclear engineer guys have found something to do, because they were quoted in the article studying these storage things. And actually, that reminded me of the fact that my brother-in-law, who was a nuclear engineer and operated a number of plants, is making his living now as a expert witness on trials where the power companies operating nuclear plants are suing the federal government for not making good on their commitment to have nuclear waste storage solution like the one at Yucca Mountain. So these plants are making all of this money now by suing the government, and I guess every year there isn't a solution to this, becomes like a new violation, and then people like my brother-in-law get paid I don't know how many hundreds of dollars an hour to testify in favor of industry.
The thing
maybe this is where the profit center is now, if there is one.
I've actually stood on the top of Yucca Mountain. I did a story about it for Scientific American. I mean, there was controversy 20 years ago. I think it was in 1990.
Yeah. It goes way back.
That I went out there, and it's the most godforsaken place that you can possibly imagine. You're standing up there, plus you look out over this desert, and it's pocked with craters from nuclear bomb explosions. Underground, they caused the ground to collapse into the big caverns created.
Well, they did above ground there too before they.
That's right.
Yeah.
So the place is totally contaminated.
I'm not saying that that's a pristine desert environment that we need to worry about saving.
I think that
I just think it makes more sense to keep it on site for
Nevada
the next century or so.
Yeah, and it's also the issue.
Or to work on the accelerated decay processes, where you shoot neutrons and things at the waste and then cause it to break down faster.
No. Reprocessing?
I guess I just love this technology too much. Not particularly nuclear.
It's a dead end. It's horrible. Yeah. It's bad for it's exciting. It's like this wonderful application of nuclear physics. I mean, it's bad. It's time to give it up once and for all. You're talking about reprocessing, which is, the nuclear, it's kind of the last hope of the.
Well, there's stuff beyond reprocessing, though. There's reprocessing where it goes back into the so-called plutonium cycle, which, in the dangers that it'll be hijacked by the kind of characters you see on the TV show 24, and they'll use it to make a bomb, or at least a dirty bomb. But there's also these other technologies that just cause it to break down into lower steps on the periodic table until they get more stable. But it doesn't cause for it doesn't necessarily, I don't believe, call for recycling the stuff as fuel.
And it produces about 10 times as much nuclear waste as you started with. Reprocessing is a joke.
So it's 10 times. But what I said was,
it's
keep
lower
working
level
on
waste.
the
It's lower level waste, but it's still waste that you have to take care of. Reprocessing.
Well, yeah, but you're always going to have waste, John. There's the second law of thermodynamics.
Not if you don't invest in more nuclear power plants. You won't always have more waste.
I don't know. I just don't think it's as clear cut to me as it is in your mind.
Hey, did you?
But yay, solar! The sun's our friend. And,
you sent me that piece.
Anyway, anyone could read my my National Geographic article and come away thinking I'm just the most enthusiastic solar person imaginable, and I probably am, or at least I was after I finished writing the article. But
okay, one other. Maybe we should talk about the mini nukes, just because if we want to talk about
the mini nuclear reactors that are being developed near my hometown in Santa Fe here by some former Los Alamos people.
I want to have one of those mini nukes for my apartment complex here. That would be.
You could get one, yeah. Not yet, but.
And we could use the our swimming pool as a coolant.
Yeah. Okay. No. You don't need that though. Let me describe it. This is a story. It was in the Albuquerque Journal by Phil Parker. There's a company called Hyperion Power, that's taken orders for 120 hot tub-sized nuclear power reactors, and it's called the Hyperion Power Module, and you can bury them in the ground, and it provides enough energy to power 20,000 homes for 8 to 10 years. And the idea is you order these from the factory, they come sealed with the fuel already in them, and they're kind of like iPods and iPads. When the battery burns out, you have to either send them back to the factory to have the battery replaced, or you discard them and buy a new one. So at no time does the operator have any way, in theory, to get into the plant to tamper with the fuel. They're these little sealed things. But the reason these guys got into it, or at least what they say, is that, he says, we started this company to clean water in Africa. And they just have become appalled by, there's been a spate of recent news on, what's a very old problem about just water cleanliness and all the people who were sick constantly in Africa because they don't have the energy to clean the water. And they're doing this for this idealistic, cause of developing very intense, long-lasting, reasonably priced, relatively power supplies to use in third world countries for things like water purification. But I knew this would just drive you crazy. So.
Yeah, it reminded me of a story that Bill Broad did recently on how the Russians, they're obviously trying to get a little juice out of their decaying nuclear program, and so they are thinking about marketing submarine nuclear reactors as commercial reactors. It sounds very similar to what you're talking about, but there are some real safety issues with the Russian nukes. You still have the problem of waste. I mean, it's a really nice sort of vision to have some kind of a nuclear reactor that's the size of a delivery truck, buried.
I definitely want one.
Buried in the ground in some African village, and they have free energy, but that's assuming that the technology is totally safe, that it's tamper-proof, that it can't be screwed up by the operation. That's assuming that, you said when the battery's
So why not
dead,
do it with solar instead? Is that?
Yeah. I mean, because you still have the problem of waste. You still have the problem of bad people deciding to do something to these reactors.
Yeah. Well, I think as long as we have bad people, we're going to.
No, but
I don't know. I think you just have to deal with that. But anyway,
So, I don't know. I guess I'm trying to keep open-minded on nuclear power, but I guess it's pretty obvious that I'm not.
Well, it was an interesting piece. It made me think and helped clarify what, at least at the moment, I think I believe.
Yeah. So, all right. What else? Have we beaten? Have we beaten nuclear
Yeah. Oh,
power
yeah. I think. Yeah. Totally.
to
Yeah.
death?
Trying to think of what else we were. Oh, I was going to mention. I had Daniel Dennett over for dinner last Friday.
Really?
Yeah, he turns out he's spending a few months. He and his wife Susan in Santa Fe, and he's some kind of fellow at the Santa Fe Institute.
Well, remind people who Dan Dennett is.
Oh yeah, Dan Dennett is the philosopher at Tufts University. He's kind of on the edge between philosophy and cognitive science, and to me, he's most famous for writing this wonderful book called Consciousness Explained.
Right.
But he's probably more famous to more people as being some people call him one of the new atheists, as if, I don't know what that means. I mean, he's a very self-proclaimed atheist. He wrote a book called Breaking the Spell, but he's far less shrill than Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens, who I think he hangs out with quite a lot. But while we were having dinner, he was describing this project that he's been working on called the let's see what the official name is. There was a good article in the Boston Globe that I'll link to. The article was called "The Unbelievers: What Happens When a Minister Decides There's No God." So Dennett basically says when he was writing Breaking the Spell and interviewed, a lot of deeply religious people, including people of the cloth, he was struck by a number of them that he ran into and said, well, they don't actually believe any of the real dogma of their church, whatever church it was, that they just keep doing this because they got into it and at some point they lost their faith. And there was one guy who hadn't even told his wife this because it was such a big deal, and they were kind of in the closet as atheists in the clergy, and feeling that they sort of wish they could meet some other ones, but it's not the kind of subject you bring up. So so anyway, Dennett's been doing this research project, and they've just had some preliminary anecdotal results from this article, and then they're, when it's done, they're hoping to have some actual, estimates of the percentage of people in the clergy and presumably in various denominations who actually don't believe this stuff. And I just wanted to read something that Dennett said that, really contrasts with what Dawkins would say about religion. He said basically he thinks religion should not, he knows it's not going to go away, and he says it shouldn't, but it should evolve into an opportunity to join people in a more morally meaningful activity. I think that we can take a lot of lessons from religions, which are brilliantly designed to bring people in just that way, with art and music and ritual, beautiful building, induction ceremonies. We should do as secular organizations what Bach did. He took these great old choral melodies that were deeply ingrained into the bones of audiences, and he built on them. So basically secularized religion, but keeping it as this moral force or excuse for people to come together and help each other out.
Yeah.
Sounds kind of Robert Wright-ish.
Did he mention the Brights? Is he still into?
No, he doesn't. Yeah, no, he didn't mention that.
Yeah. I don't know. George, do you feel the need to be part of some kind of organization or gigantic group of people who share your spiritual yearnings?
Totally not. Totally not. But maybe I get that in other ways. I mean, maybe having this invisible audience for my books.
Yeah.
Or something like that. Maybe that's where we get our little cohesion buzz or something. But yeah, no, I don't feel that need. But
I think that's the problem that I have with the Bright. So just to remind people.
Oh yeah, the Bright. Yeah, tell us.
Bright is a term that was coined by. It wasn't any of the new atheists. It was a couple of people who were not that well known as an alternative to atheist or even agnostic, which they thought are too negative, to describe people who don't really believe in God or have a particular faith, who have more of a secular outlook. And there are various people who tried to popularize it, including Dawkins and Dennett and others.
Yeah, Dennett kind of embraced that term publicly, didn't he?
Yeah, he wrote an op-ed piece about it for the New York Times, I think. And the problem, and I ended up.
It's really bad. I mean, it's just such a smug, elitist.
It is.
Tone to it.
And so I ended up writing about that trend toward people who don't have faith trying to band together and become even a political force. Most of this happened under the Bush administration.
Yeah.
And I said that I thought that the whole problem that we have is a recurrent problem through human history is that people seem to feel this need to identify with a larger group of people who supposedly share their
Right.
sense of what makes life meaningful. Why can't we be content? I mean, it's so obvious that the way that what we decide is meaningful and what sort of gets us through the day and through dark periods in life is so idiosyncratic, so unique to each one of us. Why can't that be seen as a kind of personal aesthetic taste instead of a dogma that as many people as possible should share? Because once you start talking about it as something that it's good for you and therefore it must be good for others, that's whether it's atheism or Catholicism, that's where the problems start to arise.
Yeah, no, I agree, and it's not. And to be fair, it's not. I mean, some people who belong to religion or a church have no proselytizing drive at all. They don't feel like it's something that's good and great and it benefits them, and they feel like therefore it should spread and ideally become universal. But they're just in their own church. They have their own friends in their social group, and then it just gives them this feeling of somewhat extended family. It's obviously very important to a lot of people, and it's nothing I feel a yearning for, but I know a lot of people do. And...
Well, it makes me feel good that there's some people. I like the Beatles, and my daughter Sky now has I listen to her iPod playlist, and it delights me when old Beatles songs crop up on it, mixed in with bands that are in their early 20s.
Well, yeah. If you talk about postmodern mix.
And so that's cool. And it's nice when other people share your sense of what's interesting and beautiful. But
it's nice when you occasionally you have a dinner party with people that like-minded. But, hopefully not completely like-minded because that can be boring. And but just the camaraderie and, self-support of one another's views. And it's definitely good. But, of course, you can get too insular and isolated and need to be exposed to other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Let me read one more thing that Dennett said that really kind of struck me. I had the same experience where, when I was growing up, we used to go to the Methodist church in Albuquerque, and all of us kids just hated it, and it kind of became clear that my father wasn't really that into it too. But I could never tell about my mother. I think she was the main motivating force. But so we go to church less and less often. Then at some point, and I think it was probably my father probably was invited by one of his fellow doctors or something to come to a service at the Unitarian Church. Mm-hmm. And I just remember going to this thing and just thinking how ridiculous it was. As I recall, it started, instead of a sermon, we had a scientist from the University of New Mexico, this guy Charles Hyder, who was a big anti-nuclear activist, and he was giving a sermon on the dangers of nuclear power, or rather a lecture.
Right on.
So that was the sermon, and then we got together and rose up to sing these hymnals with these words basically about how God loves us because he's made us skeptical and we don't really have to believe in him, and all of this just ridiculous. It's just like, why? So then why, do you feel like you have to go to the Unitarian Church? Just don't go to church, which is what I wanted. Anyway, so Dennett said something similar to that. He said, I know and love Unitarians, but I don't like the words to their hymns. The words are so insipid, I can't stand them. I'd rather sing the good old Rip Snorton words and then put a little flashing light over the pulpit that says, metaphor.
That's funny. I grew up Catholic, and and I guess part of the appeal of Catholicism was that it was so. I mean, there was a lot of substance there, even if the substance was in so many ways completely illogical and wrong-headed. And of course, the rituals are so beautiful and
the layers, the history, the exegesis.
Yeah, but I don't know. Unitarians, I guess it's you have kind of the shell of religion, and it brings people together, and they can all kind of nod at each other and feel that they're sharing something. I don't know, some feeling of goodwill. I
Yeah,
guess.
they have bake sales and
Yeah.
stuff like this, and and then a mutual support group. I mean, it's nice when someone in your family dies and people come over and bring casseroles and things,
Yeah.
but you don't necessarily need a church to do that.
No. But yeah. Oh, so I just saw a friend of yours recently, since you mentioned Dan Dennett. Last week, Louisa Gilder came to Stevens and gave a talk on her book, The Age of Entanglement, which is a history of quantum mechanics that focuses in particular on the concept of entanglement, which is sort of at the core of quantum weirdness. And just the idea of it is that, let's say you have an atom that emits two photons at the same time. In a sense, quantum mechanics describes those two photons as they go in opposite directions and even toward the opposite edges of the universe as one entity.
Yeah, and that entangle. The EPR, spooky action at a distance.
Yeah,
Einstein.
And that if you when you finally measure one particle at one edge of the universe, you determine its properties, and instantaneously you determine the properties of the other particle at the other end of the universe. And
yet no information passes because that would have to be superluminal.
That's right.
So
but
it's
and this was something that Einstein had kind of pulled out of the quantum of the quantum equations and said, this is crazy, it's impossible, it can't be this way. This is sort of kind of a violation of causality. It's a violation of special relativity, and yet experiments have confirmed that entanglement is real. We now have quantum computers and encryption systems that exploit entanglement to do things that classical systems can't do. And anyway, Louisa talked about it all. She was incredibly charming.
Isn't she wonderful?
She's just like...
It's a wonderful book. She's a wonderful person.
Yeah, the book is, and if people want to, they can go back and look at the great talk that you did with Louisa, I guess, I don't know.
Yeah, when it came out. Yeah, The Age of Entanglement.
Yeah, and...
Out in paperback now, I think, from Vintage.
Yes, definitely. And the book is told largely in the form of these conversations between the different scientists. I think some of them are literal transcripts of letters and so forth, and others Louisa has reconstructed from historical documents.
Yeah.
So anyway, it was
very well done. It was really a labor of love. She started working on it. I think it was her senior thesis when she was at Dartmouth.
Yeah, but I mean, God, she still looks like she's about. I don't know. She must be 25, but she's very youthful looking.
Yeah, and she gives a good lecture.
Yeah, and just
so enthusiastic,
overflowing with excitement for the topic. Yeah. So my students just loved her. It was great.
Yeah, I can't wait for her next book.
Yeah. So.
Well, that's good. I remember because she was going to give that lecture before, and then she came down with a bad case of the flu, so you had to reschedule it. Yeah. Yep. Mm-hmm. Who else do you have coming?
I've got only one lecture left, and it is the world-famous oceanographer Sylvia Earle, who is coming to Stevens on April 28th to receive the Green Book Award.
The Green Award, that's right. We talked about her briefly when she got that.
Yeah, so this is for a book. Here, let me go get it. Here, I'll just flash it. The World is Blue, which is, the subtitle is How Our Fate and the Oceans Are One. And it's, it's basically about all the horrible things that are happening. I wonder if she says anything about nuclear power. All the horrible things that we're doing to the oceans, the coral reefs, of course, and the collapse of various marine species. And but it's not fatalistic. She's saying that there are lots of things that we can and must do to revive the health of the oceans. So she's a very inspirational figure. She obviously sees science and engineering as the solution to these sorts of problems. So she's the perfect speaker for Stevens. So.
Oh, that'll be great.
Yeah, can't wait.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I'm just basically, I actually just finished an article that's in the editing mill now for Slate about, we talked before about how Santa Fe's become kind of a hotbed for the electrosensitives who
Right.
think that the electromagnetic waves from cell phones and Wi-Fi are causing all these maladies. So I have a piece on that coming up, and that's the main thing I've been working on. So we can talk about that and other things next time we get together.
That should be fun. Oh,
Yeah.
All those new agers are going to be pissed off at you, George.
Yeah, these are very sophisticated ones. One of them is a biophysicist at Los Alamos who believes this stuff to the extent that he wears kind of a metallic headdress-like thing to protect his brain when he goes to city council hearings if they don't agree to turn the Wi-Fi off before he enters the room. So it's been interesting. I mean, these people that I respect and who are very intelligent and giving me citation after citation for these papers, but then I look at them and then I just don't, like the mainstream of science doesn't see what they see there. It's an interesting phenomenon. So
there's no craziness like scientific craziness.
Yeah.
Actually, engineers, they are the truth. Oh God, the letters that I get or that have the really fine print or the big bold print and lots of different colors and Einstein was wrong and all that kind of stuff.
They tend to be from engineers.
Yeah, a lot of them.
I've kind of noticed that too. I mean, I hate to make such a sweeping statement, but I noticed too when I, writing about creationism and, people who are sort of billed as being scientists who have come over to creationism, and they tend to have degrees in like electrical engineering, and there's something about this engineering mentality in which everything is, connected in this web of causality and this kind of engineering view of the world in which everything is well engineered.
Right.
So it fits in perfectly with creationism in some people's minds, and then also it seems to work itself out. And the speed of light isn't really the upper limit of information transfer. Or quantum mechanics is wrong. You get a lot of those because engineers. I mean, you're really dealing with the causal world, so you really maybe become skewed to believing everything is explicable that way. I don't know. I haven't been able to really understand it.
Yeah. Well, the engineers at my school are all completely rational people who don't have any wacky views at all. But
we're talking about a fringe that just happened to also be engineers. Don't want to get you in trouble.
No, wouldn't want that. All right, we're over an hour. Go figure.
Sounds good. So out to the nice spring day.
Yeah, it's really nice here too. So okay, George,
John, it's great talking to you.
Same here. All right.
Glad we disagree about something.
Yeah, I'll talk to you again soon.
Okay, John, take it easy.